When tuning a car for the menu book races, you can't just slap on some racing slicks and call it a day and start racing the car. There are some changes that have to be made. I'm going to drive this car, RS 1.5 Hertz. It's stock suspension, 1.5 Hertz. This is a stock suspension. I made some upgrades to this car when I raced it in the required races. Close ratio transmission, high gear, some power upgrades, and some weight reduction apparently. But anyway, this is the stock suspension. I've put on some racing brakes, racing pads, and a brake controller, which is set to 0, so it doesn't matter. And I turned off the ABS as well as the counter steer assist. And you'll see this first turn, if I just mash the brakes into the turn, it just rotates. That is the braking zone, by the way, for these tires in this car. If I underdrive the car, I can get it around the track, but it's very oversteery, and you can see the suspension is swinging around all over the place. There are some settings that have to be changed, and the main setting is the suspension stiffness. I'm going to finish this lap. I'll try to drive clean, so I'm very delicately on the brakes, and it's just oversteering. And this is driving the car in the dry. It's much more difficult to drive the car with racing slicks in the wet, without the proper wet weather racing tires. Very lightly touching the brakes. As you can see, it's very oversteery on the brakes. Okay, on to the next setting for the racing tires. So if I choose the 3 Hertz here, the Racing Softs, I've made some changes. This is 3 Hertz. You could max this out to 320. Anywhere in the upper 3s or lower 3s is in range for these racing tires. I like the rear stiffer than the front and front wheel drive cars. I maxed out the front anti-roll bar and did the same power and brake settings as the other setup. Also have ABS and steering assist off. The car is much more controllable on the brakes. I was even locking the inside tire. What I should have done was install a limited slip differential. Oops, too wide. The suspension is still too soft for these tires. I mean, I could bump it up to 320 in the front, or 3.2 I should say, but that's not much of a change. What I would really like is a stiffer in the rear, and keep the front suspension around 3 or so. clearly the car is visually more stable than with the soft suspension. Even though this car is very light, because there's so much grip, the suspension needs to be really stiff. So normally a car would be tuned for regular daily driving, and it's optimized for being smooth over the bumps. And so, and not optimized for cornering with high G. Whoa. And so the suspension is a lot softer than a racing setup would be. That's about that. So if you're using this car to do the menu books in the very beginning, I recommend using actually sports soft tires. And these are my settings for the sports soft tires. I don't even have sports suspension, that's right, which is not adjustable. This is what I used when I was racing the car for the menu books. And the powered upgrades, normal brakes. And even this suspension is too soft for these tires, sports soft. And the reason why I recommend the sports soft is because of the weather changes. If the track is wet, street tires perform better than race tires in the wet. Unless you have racing wet tires, or wet weather racing tires, which perform terribly in the dry. So if it's mixed conditions, it's better to have the sports tires or the racing intermediate wet tires, which I have found in very light testing. I haven't done very much testing with it, but in the testing I have done, the racing intermediate wet tires are about 1 to 2/10 faster than the sports soft tires. Till the next one.